Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Green, president of the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for this evening's Conversations at the Newberry program, Chicago and Civil Rights in the 1960s, with Claiborne Carson and Kevin Boyle. The Conversations at the Newberry series, now in its 11th year, is generously sponsored by Sue and Melvin Gray. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, we've been free and open to the public and dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us through conversations like this one. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our research opportunities, collections and exhibitions, our many digital resources, online and on-site classes, and our virtual and in-person public programs. I also encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. During the program, you can enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube. And as time permits, our speakers will respond. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Kevin Boyle is the William Smith Mason Professor of American History at Northwestern University. His most recent book is The Shattering, America in the 1960s, which was just published this fall by W.W. Norton. The Shattering tells a narrative history of the decade whose conflicts shattered America's post-war order and divide us still. Kevin's work on the book began when he stumbled across an obscure photo of a Chicago neighborhood community celebrating the 4th of July in 1961. I'm sure we'll hear about that photo this evening. Kevin Boyle's 4 other books include Arc of Justice, a saga of race, civil rights, and murder in the Jazz Age, which received the National Book Award for nonfiction, the Chicago Tribune's Heartland Prize, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Tolerance Book Award. It was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Kevin Boyle has had fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation. He earned his PhD at the University of Michigan. Kevin has been a good friend of the Newberry for many years, and we're happy to welcome him back this evening. Claiborne Carson has devoted much of his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movements King inspired. Since receiving his doctorate from UCLA in 1975, Dr. Carson has taught at Stanford University, where he is Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History Emeritus. In 1985, the late Coretta Scott King invited Dr. Carson to direct a long-term project to edit and publish the authoritative edition of her late husband's speeches, sermons, correspondence, publications, and unpublished writings. Under Dr. Carson's direction, the King Papers Project has produced 7 volumes of the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. Carson's publications include, among others, In Struggle, SNCC and the Black Awakening of the 1960s, Malcolm X, the FBI File, The Struggle for Freedom, A History of African Americans, and a memoir, Martin's Dream, My Journey and the Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Professor Carson also edited the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., compiled from King's autobiographical writings and published in more than a dozen languages. I'm honored to welcome Professor Carson to the Newberry for this program, and so pleased that he's agreed to join this conversation. Now I'll hand things over to Professors Boyle and Professor Carson. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
So first of all, let me say thank you to Professor Green and the Newberry Library for hosting us tonight and for setting up this event. And I just have to say on a personal level, how honored I am and how excited I am to be in conversation with Professor Carson, whose work I have admired for so many years. He's really a model of everything you want to see in a historian. And it's really an honor to be able to share a little bit of time with him this evening and be in conversation. When I think about the 1960s, which I have to admit I've been doing a bit these days, I really see 1963 as a pivotal point in the decade, as a really crucial moment, stretching really a decisive point in American history since that moment, stretching from the Birmingham campaign in the spring through the March on Washington, and then the events, of course, that followed that. And I was just kind of curious, Professor Carson, whether you see it that way too.
Well, first of all, thank you for the book because I felt that it was in some way a story of my adult life. And I haven't spent hardly any time in Chicago and none during the 1960s, but I think a very similar book could have been written about Los Angeles, where I spent most of that time, about San Francisco and many other cities. That it was that combination of the local and the national that shaped the lives of so many people in all of these places. You know, for example, for me, the March on Washington when I was 19 years old was a pivotal point in my life, and all the things that followed that brought me into contact with so many of the people that you mentioned in your book. Stokely Carmichael was the person I met right before the March on Washington, when he was, becoming known as a Mississippi organizer. Mm-hmm. So, and after that, I found so many other names of people I interacted with during that time. So thank you for providing this perspective and bringing it together with the events in Chicago.
So what brought you to did you actually go to the March on Washington?
Yes, I did. I just, I grew up in New Mexico, and I had always been curious about the civil rights struggle. And I was invited to the National Student Association meeting in Indiana that year. And that's where I met Stokely Carmichael and many of the other people. One of the major questions was whether the students would all be supporting the March on Washington. And I was kind of struck by the fact that when I told Stokely Carmichael that I was going, he kind of put it down and said, "Why are you going to that picnic? Why don't you join us in Albany, Georgia, or Mississippi, or some of these places?" And I hesitated to tell him that going to the march was the most radical thing I'd done in my life up to that point. But it was a part of my adventure. And I think that that's what I see as the rich part of your book, is that you bring together those individual stories and put them in this national and even international tapestry.
I think to me, my sense of history is driven so much by that connection between the personal, that kind of intimate experience, and the larger story that we tend to think of as history. You kind of imagine history as this series of massive events, and really the more compelling piece to me is how it connects with individual people, how it becomes an intimate history as much as a big sprawling history. I also loved the point you just made that going to the march was one of the most radical things that you had ever done, because I think that was true for an awful lot of people, and I'd love to hear your take really on one of the things that I find really hard to do when I'm teaching civil rights history, because no one can hear Martin Luther King's speech anymore. No one could, it's become so commonplace that it kind of washes over you rather than it's really hard to get students to listen to it, to hear what he's actually saying. And it's a radical speech in an awful lot of ways.
Especially when you combine it with John Lewis's speech.
Yes.
Where, he was seen as the moderate young person, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and yet he uses that phrase, one man, one vote is the African cry. It should be ours too. So you see, even at that march, which was seen as a very middle class and moderate event, there were voices. They tried to silence them because they used the term revolution. you know, and I think A. Philip Randolph was the March leader, and he said, "Well, I use that term all the time." And I don't know why, a nation that began as a revolution should fear the word revolution.
Yeah. And it is, and it really was a revolutionary period between, I think, between 63 and 65. It was a revolutionary transformation in the United States, the sense that this racial order was, at least in part, breaking open. It's a remarkable moment in American history. I love the photo you have behind you, that, it kind of captures that sense of people reclaiming the country or remaking the country. It really feels like that's what happened in those years between 63 and 1965.
But I think one thing that you also point out, though, is now Martin Luther King's last book is Where Do We Go From Here? And I always think that the most critical word in that is we. How can we as a nation decide where we're going to go when we can't decide who we are? Because when you look at Chicago during that time, are we the civil rights marchers, or are we the young kids with the Nazi flags and the racial epithets aimed at Martin Luther King? I kind of wonder, like, those teenagers who were doing that, they're probably still around our age now.
Yeah.
What are their politics? Do they have any regrets over that? This is, when I see this nation with all of its divisions, it's not a surprise to anyone who's been awake during these years.
Yeah, that's really first of all, I just love that idea of what are those people doing now? I just suddenly, the minute you said that, I thought, oh my gosh, there's a research question. That's a great question. I suddenly have this urge to rush out to the archives and see if I could track down some of those people, because that is such a fabulous question. That there's that immense polarization. King comes to Chicago in 66. And those scenes that you're describing of him going into Gage Park and into Marquette Park, and people shouting the most appalling racial things, and then things that infused as well with anti-Semitism. And it's a year after Selma. It's a year after that moment where it suddenly seemed as if the country was pivoting. And then King comes to Chicago and he runs up against the northern system of segregation. Now, that segregation that says that African Americans and whites are going to live in separate neighborhoods, and they're going to be separate, and they're going to be unequal. And that system doesn't break. That, he's able to break through the disenfranchisement of Alabama. He can't break through the disenfranchisement, the form of disenfranchisement in Chicago.
Yeah, and 64 is, of course, the election year. And you point out that Lyndon Johnson won an overwhelming victory, but you also point out how flawed that was, in the sense of it disguised all the changes that were going on in the voting patterns in the United States. It's hard for some people to realize that that was the last election in which the majority of the white Americans voted for a Democrat.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened since. And it might not have even happened then, if not for a number of things that kind of handed the victory to Johnson, because change was occurring even at that point, but we just didn't see it.
Yeah, it's almost, in retrospect, it's almost as if the remarkable thing in 64 is that the white vote goes to Lyndon Johnson, that Lyndon Johnson wins this extraordinary victory. It's almost, that's what shouldn't have happened. That all the trend lines were actually moving in the other direction, moving towards what would become Richard Nixon's victories. And I think there are obviously some really key factors that played into that. Barry Goldwater maybe being the most important of them, that he was a man whose politics was incredibly out of step with that historic moment. And Kennedy's assassination, obviously, and Johnson's masterful handling of the aftermath of that. So there's a lot of particular factors, but as you said, the racial lines were shifting in the other direction. That what people came to call white backlash was already discernible by 64. I think so many people want to look back on King particularly and say, well, he was always popular with whites. He was always the moderate voice of the civil rights movement. But as you know way better than I do, that's simply not true.
Well, you have things to say about the free speech movement along those lines. And in California, this led directly to the election of Ronald Reagan and what had been an overwhelmingly Democratic state. So I think those changes were going on really rapidly, but I think that they were moving in so many different directions, we didn't see the overall direction.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the white South had always voted for one political party. It just changed. They just changed to the other party.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing that there might be actually generations of white Southerners from grandparents to grandkids who have always had a one-party system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's only one party that even warrants their vote.
Yeah.
But that has not. I think what we see now is, where is that all going to end? But I think and where did it begin?
Yeah.
Because you don't start the book in the mid-60s. It even starts before that, and many historians have kind of looked at the 50s and said, well, to some degree, it seemed like nothing happened, but a lot of things happened.
Yes, huge amounts of things happened. And it's one of the challenges in kind of conceptualizing the book, right? That I said that this is a book about the 1960s, but as you point out, you can't start a book on the 1960s in 1960. Once upon a time, people thought, well, John Kennedy's election marked something fundamentally changing, but I don't think historians can see it that way anymore. I don't think that holds up anymore. What do you do with the fact that there was Brown v. Board of Education? What do you do with the fact that it took 20 years of litigation to get to Brown v. Board of Education? What do you do with Emmett Till, Little Rock, Montgomery? The racial issue has such a long history that you almost feel awkward entering anywhere in the story to say you have to start. Here's a spot to start.
And it wasn't just racial, also gender issues.
Yeah.
I think one of the themes that you have in the book that we didn't notice very much at that time. These court cases that were just coming up, and we had no idea that in 2021 we would still be wondering about the outcome of that debate over birth control and over abortion.
Yeah. That to me was such a compelling story, because 1965, the Supreme Court, thanks to Estelle Griswold, really creates a brand new right. The right to privacy just didn't exist, and the Supreme Court created it. And the history behind that, and then the implications of that, like you said, we're still living with today. Same with the theme of the U.S.'s place in the world, right? It's the story of Vietnam, of course, runs through so much of the 1960s story, and it intersects with race in so many ways as well. But of course, it stretches all the way back to, I think, the lessons of World War II. And you don't get Vietnam if you don't get that sense that something went horribly wrong at Munich in 1938. And then here we are in the summer of 2021 watching another example of American nation building kind of collapsing in on itself in Afghanistan. Here we are all these years later, all these decades later, seeing the history of the 60s still kind of playing in our day.
I was curious about, and I have my favorites in the book, or people, like Mary King, who you mentioned, people who were not famous, Ella Baker, but people who were doing, when we look back, remarkably brave things to do. They were moving in directions that would become controversial. And I see a lot of implications of that now for the work that I'm doing in terms of talking about human rights and what do we mean by human rights. And I think that all of those were issues that were below the surface for a long time, and now they're becoming kind of central to where are we going in the future.
Yeah, it is so remarkable. To me, really the essence of the 60s, if you try to boil down, which is probably a dangerous thing to do, to boil down a decade to a central dynamic, it is the ways in which people who were excluded from what people like to call a consensus, which of course wasn't a consensus at all, this kind of 1950s alignment, the people who were excluded demanding that their opportunity to be included in the nation and to define the course of the nation. That's such a compelling story. And like you said, it's a story that we continue to tell. In some ways, it's a profoundly American story.
Yeah, maybe what has happened is that a lot of groups that just were not, their stories were not being told. I was just recently watching an interview with Martin Luther King. I guess it was on Meet the Press in the early 1960s. And he was interviewed along with Roy Wilkins. I noticed that all the interviewers asked fairly hostile questions. There's this notion that Martin Luther King got kind treatment from the press. All you have to do is listen to that. Why are you associating with communists? Why are you disrupting, having these disruptive demonstrations? The whole thrust of it was very negative, and all the interviewers were male.
Mm-hmm.
There was not a female voice anywhere to be seen, and now when you think back, you could look at Face the Nation, Meet the Press, all of those voices of authority were all male.
Yeah, and presumably they were all white too, I suspect.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it kind of goes without saying, right? Yeah, and one of the things that, I suppose this is only tangential, but I don't think it's completely tangential. One of the things that I realized from teaching, really, it took me a while being kind of slow on these points, to realize is that the United States in 1960 had never, at least in the 20th century, late 19th century, never been more homogenous. It had been so long, it had been now since the 1920s that immigration restriction had been in place. So the percentage of Americans who were foreign born was really strikingly low. The Asian American population in the United States was like less than 0.5%. The Latino population it's a lot harder to measure, but probably no more than 3 or 4% of the population. African Americans were easily the largest non-white group in the nation. It's a very different nation. And then on top of it, with that demographic alignment, but then these kind of immense powers of exclusion, right? Who would ever imagine that on Meet the Press, you might have a woman, that you might have a person of color? It's kind of unimaginable to a lot of the white community. They just couldn't imagine a different world.
And I think that was the way it was perceived by people in it. I mean, I think that if you went back and interviewed them, and to some degree you have in the sense of using documents, there was that that blindness
Yeah.
to these pressing issues. And
Yeah.
and I think that there was that this was normal. This was the normal way America should be. There shouldn't be demonstrations. There shouldn't be, what do you have to demonstrate about?
Yes.
There might be strikes, but we should try to, not emphasize that either. So a lot of the things that were going on that were disruptive of that, who would know about the urban riots that were taking place every time a Black family
Yeah.
tried to move into a neighborhood?
Yeah.
And the level of violence that was just kind of dismissed as, oh, there was a ruckus over in this neighborhood. And it was very quickly, there's a wonderful book, I forgot the person who wrote it, about the neighborhood transformation during the 50s, where the number of violent incidents, and I'm talking about a mob coming in and throwing rocks at a Black person who dared to move into a neighborhood, that was common.
Yeah.
But it was not seen as something to be given wide publicity in the newspaper or anything else.
Yep. Yeah, that is so.
That was happening in the North too, and
more so in the North, I think. I mean, Chicago was kind of infamous for these incidents and then to lay on top of that dynamic, white flight, the ability of whites to race off to a neighborhood the moment there was a sign of any sort of racial change. The level of violence and the level of segregation in the North was so intense. And yet somehow, as you said, white people had such a strong sense that people in places like Chicago or Detroit, which is where I'm from, white people had a sense that was just the way it was. That was just normal. That it was a given that neighborhoods are going to be segregated, and that if someone broke that, the problem was on them. And increasingly, they saw what happened. The segregation in the South is somehow terrible and abhorrent, right? Why would you make someone ride in the back of a bus? And yet the segregation that was so plainly obvious in their own neighborhoods, they didn't think about as segregation. They thought of it as just a kind of natural order of things, which is why I think when King led those marches onto the west side of Chicago, people were outraged. Why, this is just a rabble rousing. This is just baiting people to march into those neighborhoods. And he understood that what he was doing was exposing that this wasn't a natural system at all. It was one created by this enormous power of racism.
And yet you can see so much of our present world that is shaped by those conflicts. And obviously Michelle Obama is someone who grew up in that context.
Yeah.
And Jesse Jackson, Black Panther Party, a lot of the things that later became national in terms of their impact, you could see it happening in Chicago.
Oh, absolutely. And
Michelle, why you chose Chicago, other than the fact that you live there.
Right, nothing against Chicago. As I said, we could be having this conversation about Detroit. We could be having this conversation about Los Angeles. We could be talking about Boston. It's an American story. I love that you brought up Michelle Obama. A couple of years ago, I taught a course at Northwestern where I work for first-year students on King in Chicago. And one of the things we read at the end of the class was Michelle Obama's then brand new autobiography, because she talks so powerfully about her family when she was a child, moving into an all-white neighborhood that then all the white people fled. And it's so valuable for someone to say, there's two sides to this story. There's that white side, right? Oh, we have to move because property values were going to be destroyed. And then there's the wound that she, and I suspect so many other people, carry from watching that happen because of them, they moved into that neighborhood.
Yeah, I remember her showing a series of pictures of her classmates, and that actually moves through the grades. She starts out as one of the few black students and ends up there's no white students.
Which also is a really nice tie to another issue that I was wondering we might want to touch on, which is the story of busing and the story of school integration in the late 1960s. There is this moment where, really thanks to the NAACP's legal campaigns, there actually is a concerted public policy to try to actually integrate schools, particularly in the South, but then eventually in the North as well. And I actually see that as one of the most radical moments of the 60s activism, because what suddenly was happening is that all of these white families who certainly saw racial change on TV, right, who saw a protest or who saw Dr. King, but it was at a distance from them, suddenly they were on the front lines of racial change. And that turned out to be a really different dynamic than a transformative dynamic in the late 60s and early 70s.
I think also we should maybe spend some time talking about the war in Vietnam.
We should. Yeah, that's
right. I think, again, going on a personal level, that, I got my draft notice like a lot of other people, and that in a way shaped my life, because I was one of those who decided I wasn't going to go to war. And I had grown up actually in a military family. My father was an officer in the military. I grew up in Los Alamos. And, so when I was in high school, I wanted to go to the military academies. I was a nominee to West Point and Air Force Academy. So who would have predicted that someone from that kind of a background would make a decision against the war? But I think it happened more than we can imagine, because I think everybody of my age had to face those choices, and that was in some ways our first really adult decision, because we knew that decision was going to affect whether you went into the service or didn't go into the service or resisted. It was going to affect the rest of your life.
So can I ask you two things? What happened and how did your father react?
Yeah, those are interesting questions. I finally decided that I was going to refuse the draft. My father had a very high security clearance, and so did I actually before all this happened, because I worked at the lab. But once I started becoming active in the anti-war movement, my father and I just had a decision that we were not going to discuss politics. But he liked discussing politics. And he had his own opinions about the war, which, he was critical of it not because he was against the war, but he thought it was a stupid war. But in any case, he also, because he had a security clearance and I became active in the anti-war movement, he would get called in. What is your son doing? What have you talked about? So we just made a decision that whenever we got together, we would talk about sports. During all the time of the Vietnam War, I don't think there may be one conversation about the war or about my attitude about the war. He just recognized that it's not something that he could change. But talking about it, he would have to repeat it too. He would have to say, yes, we talked about the war. My son is very much opposed to it. And he just didn't want to get into that.
And did you ever talk about it? Were you ever able to come back to that, years later?
Yeah, I mean, I think once the war um, began to wind down, I do remember sometimes when he was not that surprised that we lost the war. Um, but I think it was interesting because the most important thing going on in my life was what was I going to do about the draft, and I couldn't talk to my father about it, and it was not good for either of us. I think he had a lot of strong opinion, and I respected his opinions. I think just recently when Colin Powell died, I felt a certain amount like he was kind of like my dad, a person who did his duty, fought in the World War II and was, and saw his continuing duty to not stay in the active service, but he stayed in the reserves for most of his adult life. And I think he was very proud of that. And there were so many other things that that also were interesting about. He was a member of the NRA. He was a very expert marksman. So I find it odd, these days when the NRA is seen as this right-wing organization, and I knew that that's not my dad's politics. He just belonged to the NRA because he liked to. He was a very expert marksman and won awards for his marksmanship, and that was his hobby.
And you can actually literally say that the current NRA was not your father's NRA. Yeah.
That's very much the case.
I'm just so fascinated by this. I've got so many questions I'd love to ask you about this, but I'll ask you just two. Well, I won't guarantee there won't be more, but just two to start anyway. So it sounds as if
in your next book.
Got a deal. It sounds like you were never called up. Is that right?
Oh, I got drafted. I just refused to go.
Oh, okay. So you just refused.
I left the country.
Oh, you did. Okay. Did you go to Canada?
I applied to go to Canada. But for reasons which I still don't quite understand, they rejected me. And but my wife and I both left and spent time in Europe, a little bit of time in North Africa, and she got. We were trying to settle down in Spain, thinking that we could live there cheaply for a longer time. She got very sick. It turned out that she was diabetic, and I realized I had to come back, and just I kind of was very lucky in some ways in that by the time the draft board got around to finding out I was back in the United States, and that I by that time I really had a family. We had a son, and I found that having a son got me out of the draft. I don't know whether it worked all the time, but I think maybe they might have just gotten tired of trying to come after me.
You waited them out.
I think in some ways I did wait them out.
And can I ask you just, and I do promise that I'm not trying to pry, but I just find this is exactly what you and I were talking about. It's the personal that is so compelling about the past. It's the complicated ways it plays out. The way that your wife's health intersected with your politics and made the world complicated. But I won't ask about that. I wanted to come back to something you said about your dad, about your father. He thought that the war was a mistake. And I wonder if you could just talk maybe a tiny bit about that.
Well, as I said, I mean, after he realized that I was up for the draft and I was very much involved in the anti-war movement, he made a decision not to.
Right.
We would talk about, both really like sports, so we would talk about sports. But I think that his attitude was more that why are we intervening in this? You know, he had kind of gone off to fight in a war that people could understand.
Yeah.
The reasons for it. Vietnam was something else, and what I remember is that the few conversations we had, he just thought it was a very bad decision to get involved. I think he had also the Korean experience had also influenced that why get involved in these wars that we don't need.
Yeah.
And it was I think if he had been called up, he would have, he would have gone.
Sure.
And you know, by that time he was probably too old for that kind of active service. He was in the reserves, and I don't think they ever got down to the reserves in terms of calling up for Vietnam. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you know, there were a lot of questions growing up in a town like Los Alamos, where we're, you know, our main claim to fame is making atomic bombs.
Yeah.
There were a lot of issues that I only thought about later. You know, I thought it was normal that people lived in a town with, well, not normal, but it was normal for me.
It was home.
Yeah, it was home.
You know, one of the things, and we should take some questions in a minute or two, but one of the things that I was really very excited, it sounds like I'm putting this a bad way, but one of the things I'm really proud of with the book is that I emphasize that there was obviously a very powerful anti-war movement that we feel we know something about, you know, the kind of radical anti-war movement, a liberal anti-war movement. But there was a very powerful anti-war movement that it sounds like your dad really fit into, this sense of people who came from a different perspective, but really thought this war was a serious mistake, you know, who don't fit into kind of our standard definitions of an anti-war movement, and who never would have thought of marching in a protest at all, but who opposed the war for that complex mix of reasons that it sounded like your dad did.
Yeah, and I think people who read the book, The Best and the Brightest, kind of get into that. It wasn't the warmongers who directed the war. It was very intelligent people.
Yes.
And many of them liberal in their outlook.
Yes.
Who thought that the war was necessary. And I think you bring that up in the book as, you know, as one of the ways in which we look at the Kennedy administration. And I think that, you know, the roots of the war really start there. It starts with that arrogance, that power.
And that's exactly that sense that they could, in fact, manage things, complicated dynamics that could be managed, and they couldn't be.
By the way, I don't want to be remiss by telling people that your book is very readable. For those people who think that reading history books is a hard thing to do, they should read your book. It's very well written. It tells lots of interesting stories about the people. It's, to me, the way history should be written, because it's not the people in small rooms, the leaders, who make history all the time. They might think they make history, but it always gets upset by little events in the neighborhood in Chicago.
Thank you. I feel like I should just sign off now because you've made my day. So,
I can attest also to how readable the book is, and how engaging this conversation is. So thank you to Kevin and to Clay for that. We do have a lot of questions, so if I could pose some of them to you. There's one just factual kind of question that I would pose to Clay, and then there's a number of questions where we might be able to dig into Chicago a little bit. There are a number of questions about Chicago, but Clay, Nicole, who's watching, asks whether you turn to anyone for counseling on what it meant to be a conscientious objector. She mentions, for example, the American Friends Service Committee. Were you involved with organizations that were helping people think through what it meant to be a conscientious objector?
I, of course, investigated that. The fact that I had been a nominee to West Point and Air Force Academy kind of undermined my notion. The argument that I had this moral objection to war in general. So it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Michael asks, if we could talk a little bit about Chicago in 1968, which we didn't talk about. And his specific question is, do you think that Chicago 68 was an extension of the civil rights movement, or did it signal a major departure of the struggle for racial and economic justice?
So which portion of 68 is the question about? Are we talking...
I think he doesn't say specifically. I mean, he might be. I think about the convention when I think about Chicago '68, right? The Democratic convention here in Chicago that turned violent under Mayor Daley's reign. I don't know. Can you put that into, I guess, some perspective of where does that moment sit somewhere in the history of the civil rights movement that helps us understand the civil rights movement in any way?
So there's also, and this is kind of a bit of misdirection maybe, there's also, of course, the upheavals in Chicago, as there are in hundreds of other cities, that follow Dr. King's murder. And Chicago is one of 3 cities in the country after that have federal troops dispatched to them. It's DC and Baltimore and Chicago. So there is that. And then the convention is a lot harder to kind of fit into, neatly at least, into a kind of civil rights narrative, because it's obviously it's an amalgamation of protests, right? There's the protest inside the convention, there's the protest out on the street, in the streets, a combination of forces. But it's so centrally focused on the war rather than on racial justice. They're connected, obviously, but the focus is so much more on the war than it is on racial justice questions.
Mm-hmm. So Jim also asks about the current discussion of Chicago's extensive history of racial violence, and whether there's anything to be said about the city's Black liberation history and even interracial movements for civil rights here in Chicago.
So one of the key things, I think, to understanding the history of civil rights is that it's not as if there weren't civil rights activism, there weren't forms of civil rights, really vibrant civil rights movements operating in the North all the way across the 20th century. And Chicago has a long tradition of civil rights activism, African-American obviously central to that, and then interracial movements as well. One of the reasons that King picked Chicago, not the only one, but one of the reasons King picked Chicago in '66 for the place to have his kind of effort to bring his brand of protest into a northern city is because Chicago has such a vibrant civil rights movement. You know, with one of the largest civil rights protests of the early 1960s are the school strikes in Chicago. The number of people involved is enormous.
Yeah, and they invite him to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unlike some other cities where it was political leadership made it very clear they did not want Dr. King to come. So, you know, I think as historians, I think we have now moved so far beyond the kind of old story of civil rights being just a Southern movement. I think it's expanded in really, really important ways.
One thing that I would say, your title is The Shattering. But I think that's another way of looking at that is this country has a long history of violence, internal violence.
Yes.
And we don't often recognize the extent to which that makes us very different from a lot of other countries, and particularly different from European countries where violence on the scale of the United States just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it's racial violence, it's class violence, union unions and anti-unions. There's, I think you could even, I don't know whether you thought of other titles, but you have to ask what got shattered.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what got shattered was the notion that we are somehow a peaceful, democratic nation where everybody is proud to be an American.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And level of violence that runs through the book is disturbing. I will just say on a really quick side note, I am terrible at book titles. Man, they are the hardest things. And, I joke with my wife that book titles are a little bit like, when your wife is expecting, right? And you go through 10 million names and you agonize over every name, and then the child's born, and like 3 months later, you can't imagine them having another name. But man, I hate book title, try to title books.
So there's another question I think is kind of looking, this is from an anonymous attendee, maybe even looking to make Chicago exceptional in this story, which you can accept or reject. I guess they say, while Chicago bears similarities to other northern cities, it is distinct from Detroit or from New York or from Philadelphia or even from Los Angeles, cities that all have their own impact in the civil rights era from the 40s to the 70s. This questioner says there's more to Dr. King's experience in Chicago than those marches, his work on the West Side for open housing specifically, the prompting of the SCLC to come to Chicago on the West Side, not the South Side. Chicago's influence on the civil rights movement is profound, this questioner says, and just wonders if we can speak even more specifically about a Chicago civil rights story. Is that, can you accept the premise of that? Or is that, I don't know, how would you play with that idea of a specific Chicago civil rights story?
I would certainly accept it, even though I'm from Los Angeles, and I could make an argument for Los Angeles, San Francisco, and other places, but I think Chicago and New York are two of the places where I would say are so central to the civil rights story of the 20th century that it's hard to imagine without those cities.
Yeah, I would agree that Chicago has an immensely important place in civil rights history. I mean, the Brotherhood Sleeping Car Porters is really, to a huge extent, a Chicago-based organization. The Nation of Islam. There's so many examples you can point to in the long history of civil rights activism in Chicago. I guess my only slight reservation is I think you can say that of a number of cities. Los Angeles would be a terrific example. We'll take those places where we spend time. Los Angeles would be a terrific example. Detroit has a certain claim on civil rights activism as well. I do think that you can do, but obviously Chicago is central, and there is. So yes.
There's a question. This is a kind of specific question, but it's related to Stanford, though, Clay. This is from a listener named April, who is researching Stanford in the late 1960s and the tech utopia, and is wondering about whether there's an intersection, how students were planning to use technology and computers to bring power to the people. Is there anything to say about kind of the emergence of tech and civil rights at that time?
I don't see it, and I've been here for 40 some years. I wish that there was more of a relationship there. I think in some ways the tech revolution, which by the way, I was very sympathetic with. Before I was a professor at Stanford, I was a computer programmer at UCLA. So because I grew up in a very techy city, I thought about that as a career, and that's what brought me to the UCLA campus. And then I took a course, the first course in African American history ever taught at UCLA, and made a decision that was what I was meant to be. And but I think that unfortunately the tech revolution has um, until recent years, I think in some ways bypassed the civil rights revolution. It's a very hierarchical kind of tech world, and they have illusions that it's going to bring democracy and equal rights to the world and human rights. But I don't see them sacrificing technological progress and making money to achieve human rights.
Okay, maybe we can take just one more. This is from Terry, who says that there's another important event in Chicago civil rights history in 1968 that's been overshadowed by other events of that year. He writes, or Terry writes, a Southwest Side white public school was de facto desegregated by the permissive transfer of 11 Black children in January 1968. The neighborhood response was compared to responses in Little Rock and New Orleans many years before. The story was just being noticed on the national stage when Dr. King was murdered. Can you say a little bit more perhaps about whether it's that episode or just about school desegregation? Kevin, you mentioned Little Rock briefly, but we didn't really dig into it. Can you just talk a little bit about why schooling and battles over desegregation of schooling are so important for understanding this era?
Yeah,
it's a huge question. I'm giving you a short amount of time, but knowing that.
I just think that the school issue is just so profoundly central to the racial dynamics and the racial politics of the United States. They were in the late 1950s, obviously, with Little Rock being kind of the classic example. The late 60s and early 70s, that when the Supreme Court rules, essentially in 1968, the days of with all deliberate speed, you're going to desegregate schools is over. And from that point on, there's this really relentless series of Supreme Court rulings that really in the South makes the Southern schools the most integrated schools in America. And then those gradually get pushed up into the North, where it runs into this complicated question of de facto versus de jure. And the violence becomes, as Clay was saying, intense as the white families suddenly say, geez, you want us to be on the front lines of racial change? That's not how this is supposed to work. And that's one of the powerful polarizing events of American racial politics. I mean, American racial politics is always polarized, but it kicks that polarization up to a whole nother level.
I think the real opportunity to make a different America was lost after World War II because of the move to the suburbs was subsidized by the federal government, but subsidized in a way that reinforced segregation. And that was when it was possible for families to buy a 3-bedroom home for $3,000 or $4,000. That investment back then, 50 years later, is worth 100 times that much, or 1,000 times that much, maybe. We forget that the racial implications of that are still with us today.
And that's one. Oh, I'm sorry.
And for many Black families, that only began to end in the late 90s and early part of this century, right before the housing boom came apart. And many people in my family, extended family, lost enormously in the, I guess about, 12 years ago now?
Yeah, right.
And so I think that, I'm sure that your book is more interesting than the economic story, but I'm hoping that somebody will just take a look at what happened economically to Black families and white families as the result of these decisions about what kind of housing got subsidized by the federal government.
Okay, I think unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. I teased the July 4th picture from 1961 in Chicago. That's actually on the cover of Kevin's book here. But you'll have to buy the book to learn and read it to learn more about why that photo is there. But Kevin Boyle, Claiborne Carson, thank you so much for joining us this evening for Conversations at the Newberry, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We'll have a recording of this program available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. So please support the Newberry by making a gift today. As you can see here on screen, you can make a donation by visiting newberry.org/give. And I hope that you can all join us for our next virtual program, which will be on Thursday, December 2nd at 5 p.m. Central Time. We'll be joined by Pulitzer Prize winning author Louise Erdrich, who will be discussing her brand new book, The Sentence. So I hope you can join us. That's a virtual program on Thursday, December 2nd at 5 p.m. You can register for this program and other programs on our website, newberry.org. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight.